Alright, so for today's video, I'm going to continue the book of propaganda, moving on to the next section, which is called Organization of Propaganda. To begin with, propaganda must be organized in several ways. To give it the above mentioned characteristics, continuity, duration, combination of different media, an organization is required that controls the mass media, is capable of using them correctly, of calculating the effect of one or another slogan, or of replacing one campaign with another. There must be an administrative organization. Every modern state is expected to have a ministry of propaganda, whatever its actual name may be. So propaganda always is organized. That's how it works so well. Just as technicians are needed to make films and radio broadcasts, so one needs technicians of influence, sociologists and psychologists. But this indispensable administrative organization is not what we are speaking of here. What we mean is that propaganda is always institutionalized to the extent of the existence of an apparat or a machine. So, Rage Against the Machine. It is tied to realities. A great error which interferes with propaganda analysis is to believe that propaganda is solely a psychological affair, a manipulation of symbols, an abstract influence on opinions. A large number of American studies on propaganda are not valid for that reason, because they only see the psychological aspect. But all modern practitioners of propaganda have rigorously tied together psychological and physical action as inseparable elements. No propaganda is possible unless psychological influence rests on reality. And the recruiting of individuals into cadres or movements goes hand in hand with psychological manipulation. So here he's talking about how George Soros and the mayors and the police departments are being coordinated so that the Antifa protests and riots can be successful. So that I learned from Alex Jones, and that speaks to the physical action portion of propaganda. As long as no physical influence is exerted by an organization on the individual, there is no propaganda. This is decidedly not. So this is decidedly not an invention of Mao Zedong, or merely an accessory of propaganda, or the expression of a particular type of propaganda. Separation of the psychological and physical elements is an arbitrary simplification. So separation of the psychological and physical elements is an arbitrary simplification that prevents all understanding of exactly what propaganda is. So that's part of the obfuscation, is not realizing it's a physical force too. Of course, the physical organization can be of various types. It can be party organization like the Nazi, fascists, communists, in which those who are won over are absorbed and made to participate in action. Such an organization, moreover, uses force and fear in the form of mock propaganda. or such physical organization can be the integration of an entire. So he was talking about parties who are known to be violent and are also very propaganda based, political propaganda based. Or such physical organization can be the integration of an entire population into cells by agents in each block of residences. In that case, it operates inside a society by integrating the whole social body. Of course, this is accompanied by all the psychological work needed to press people into cells. Maybe that's what's going on during the lockdown. We're being pressed into cells and integrating the whole social body with agents in each block of residence. I know in my Toastmasters club there were definitely agents there, hidden and obvious ones, that were integrating the whole social body and preventing the people from uniting and having a non-propaganda based organization. Or an effective transformation can be made in the economic, political, or social domain. We know that the propagandist is also a psychological consultant to governments. He indicates what measures should or should not be taken to facilitate certain psychological manipulations. It is too often believed that propaganda serves the purpose of sugarcoating bitter pills, of making people accept policies that they would not accept spontaneously. Yeah, that is a common misconception, I think, even for me. But in most cases, propaganda seeks to point out courses of action desirable in themselves, such as helpful reforms, or getting married to a 40-year-old spinster. That's the new rage in society now. We gotta save these single mothers who are past 25, 30, 35, especially, and because that's not good for the economy to not give them access to endless amounts of money, because they love to spend that money. So, you got to tie them up to a better earning man, a harder working man. So yeah, there's a lot of propaganda going on everywhere. So in most cases, propaganda seeks to point out courses of action desirable in themselves, such as helpful reforms. Propaganda then becomes this mixture of the actual satisfaction given to the people by the reforms and subsequent exploitation of that satisfaction. So propaganda is a mixture of the actual satisfaction given to the people and exploitation of that satisfaction. It's an endless loop. Anyhow, propaganda cannot operate in a vacuum. It must be rooted in action, in a reality that is part of it. Some positive and welcome measure may be only a means of propaganda. Conversely, coercive propaganda must be tied to physical coercion, such as the cancel culture. That's physical coercion. For example, a big blow to the propaganda of the FLN in France in '58 was the noisy threat of the referendum that the roads leading to the polls would be mined and booby-trapped, that voters would be massacred and their corpses displayed, that there would be a check in each door of those who had dared to go to the polls. But none of these threats was carried out. Failure to take action is in itself counter-propaganda. So when I was at the group, the dude who posed to be my friend and mentor, he started threatening me that he's going to call the cops on me if I contact anybody in the club, and restraining orders and all this bullshit, which just scared me for a little while. But that just shows like these propagandists, they're especially because he was a government agent, obviously. These propagandists mean business, and they're really scared of our individual power if we choose to display that. So each one of you has that power to speak the truth and counter their propaganda, but it does take a lot of work to be able to see through their propaganda too. So that's the first step. Because propaganda enterprises are limited by the necessity for physical organization and action, without which the propaganda is practically non-existent. Effective propaganda can work only inside a group, principally inside a nation. So yeah, groupthink is a real danger. George Orwell talked about it because that makes propaganda more effective, and nations too. Propaganda outside the group towards other nations, for example, or towards an enemy, is necessarily weak. The principal reason for this is undoubtedly the absence of physical organization and of encirclement of the individual. One cannot reach another nation except by way of symbols, through press or radio, and even then only in sporadic fashion. Such an effort may at best raise some doubts, plant some sense of ambiguity, make people ask themselves questions, influence them by suggestions. So that's what they were blaming Trump and Russia of doing. But they could only do so much, you know? It's up to the people to decide finally. So you can't blame Russia for Trump. The premise was just wrong to start with, basically. But you know how stupid libtards can become nowadays with all the emotional propaganda out there. So in case of war, the enemy will not be demoralized by such abstract propaganda unless he is at the same time beaten by armies and pounded by bombers. So that's exactly what's going on right now with the hysterical propaganda through the news and the media. And at the same time, there's Antifa armies, army of the 12 monkeys on the streets and bombing the streets and bombing buildings. So, you know, now the Democrats don't want to talk about the negative Chinese or communist influence of propaganda going on. And that's obvious because they're causing it. Because these types are the ones to gaslight you with the very thing that they're themselves guilty of doing. And some of them are so stupid they don't even realize what they're doing. But that's the nature of our messed up world. So yeah, the Democrat is doing the propaganda right now, physical propaganda and other propaganda, normal psychological warfare. We can hardly expect great results from a simple dissemination of words unless we prepare for it by education, pre-propaganda, and sustain it by organization and action. Right? That's for us, right? Even for the truth, we have to first educate ourselves and then organize ourselves and act. Just organizing our mind is quite a challenge once you come to the other side. So where are we at? The points. This points up a major difference between communist and Western countries, which have pretty much blended today. But let's see how we used to be in the 60s. Western countries conduct their propaganda against Soviet nations solely by psychological means, with the propaganda clearly emanating from a base situated in the democratic countries themselves. So this shows their lack of effectiveness, but we know that that's not true because they started funding the jihadis in Afghanistan against the communists. So they were using force eventually, once the psychological thing got situated, I guess. By contrast, they were using it in the 60s too, in the Latin America, I think. By contrast, the Soviet Union makes very little propaganda itself. It does not seek to reach Western peoples by its radio. It confines its propaganda to organizations, secret societies, and so forth, in the form of national communist parties inside the national boundaries of the people to be propagandized. So we, in our Western countries, are not effective with our propaganda over there, although eventually the economy was successful in destroying their society. But they are allowed to come into our countries and organize in our country and thus be much more effective. As we have seen, they've taken over the whole country, and Yuri Bezmenov exposed that in the 80s, that they were already successful in taking over much of the country by 1984. So communist parties inside the national boundaries are of the people to be propagandized. Because such parties are external propaganda structures of the Soviet Union and maybe China and North Korea today, their propaganda is effective precisely because it is attached to a concrete organization capable of encirclement and continuity. So this propaganda is effective because it is attached to a concrete organization capable of encirclement of the individual and continuity of their propaganda. So one should note here the tremendous counter-propagandist effect that ensued when the United States, after all the promises by the Voice of America, failed to come to the aid of Hungary during the 1956 rebellion. To be sure, it was hardly possible for the Americans to come to the aid of the Hungarians. Nevertheless, this is something I learned as a teacher. Never make false promises, so better not to make any promises. Nevertheless, all propaganda that makes false promises turns against the propagandist. So that's a lesson America learned in Hungary. I'll be right back. Can you boil me 2 eggs? Yeah? Alright, so we're at 17 minutes now. I'm gonna drink some water, maybe eat an orange. Finish the next 2 pages. Oh shit. The fact that the presence of an internal organization is indispensable to propaganda explains in large measure why the same statements advanced by a democracy and by an authoritarian government do not have the same credibility. When France and England proclaimed that the elections held in Syria and Egypt in connection with the formation of the United Arab Republic had been a fraud, so France and England proclaimed elections held in Syria and Egypt in connection with the UAR had been a fraud and evidence of a dictatorial government, they aroused no repercussions. Because I guess they were democracies? I don't know. It was a simple affirmation from the outside, which was not repeated often enough and not heard by the people. Yet when Nasser launched a propaganda campaign a year later on the same theme, claiming that the election results in Iraq had been falsified by the imperialists and the Iraqi parliament was mockery, he set off reverberations. So here's a dictator claiming the same thing. I guess he was able to repeat it loudly enough and frequently enough compared to England and France. So it was more successful, I guess. So thus the propaganda apparatus moves the people to action, and the popular movement adds weight to the argument abroad. This is the history of the Iraqi thing and Egyptian people. You can read it. Propaganda then is no longer mere words It incites an enormous demonstration by the masses and thus becomes a fact, which gives strength to the words outside the frontiers. Unfortunately, today, people don't believe in facts. Propaganda just has to be emotionally powerful. Perhaps like it was in Nazi Germany, for people to accept it now. And if they hear the opposite facts, their mental state becomes so painful because they don't have critical thought that they don't they shoot the messenger of the truth, you know. All right. So we must not, however, conclude from the So we must not conclude from the decisive importance of organization that psychological action is futile. It is one, but not the only one, indispensable piece of the propaganda mechanism. The manipulation of symbols is necessary for three reasons. First of all, it persuades the individual to enter the framework of an organization. Second, it furnishes him with reasons, justifications, motivations for action. That's how they take over your soul. Third, it obtains his total allegiance. More and more, we are learning that genuine compliance is essential if action is to be effective. The worker, the soldier, and the partisan must believe in what they're doing, must put all their heart and their goodwill into it. They must also find their equilibrium, their satisfactions in their actions. So I see these soldiers, they're totally mind controlled and have no sense of right or wrong. Because the worker, the soldier, and the partisan must believe in what they're doing. Even when I was a teacher, I was starting to believe in what I was doing. But I was just a fucking stooge or a puppet of the intellectual tyrants. But anyway, I tried. All this is a result of psychological influence, which cannot attain great results alone, but which can attempt anything when combining with organization. That's why it's so important to get the kids structured, a learning environment, because they have to be encircled with the continuity of the propaganda apparatus. Continuous propaganda. Finally, the presence of organization creates one more phenomenon. Hold on. So if right here down there it says if the propagandist is too self-intoxicated and so believe so much in their own system that they don't see the whole reality, then they get caught in their own trap and their psychological campaign fails. So that's like to do with the dispassionate observer philosophy of the perfect propagandist. So anyway, that's why it's organizational, so everyone can not get carried away, I guess. They keep each other in check because it's all top-down run, I guess. So finally, the presence of the organization creates one more phenomenon. The propagandist is always separated from the propagandee. He remains a stranger to him. This is how they get up in their ivory towers. Even in the actual contact of human relations at meetings, in door-to-door visits, the propagandist is of a different order. He is nothing else and nothing more than the representative of the organization, or rather a delegated fraction of it. He remains a manipulator in the shadow of the machine. He knows why he speaks certain words and what effect they should have. His words are no longer human words, but technically calculated words. They no longer express a feeling or a spontaneous idea, but reflect an organization, even when they seem entirely spontaneous. Thus, the propagandist is never asked to be involved in what he is saying, for if it becomes necessary, he may be asked to say the exact opposite with a similar conviction. He must, of course, believe in the cause he serves, but not in his particular argument. Here come the two-faced, the dual-tongued propagandist. On the other hand, the propagandist hears the words spoken to him here and now, and the argument presented to him in which he is asked to believe. He must take them to be human words, spontaneous and carried by conviction, all of which are not true. Obviously, if the propagandist were left to himself, if it were only a matter of psychological action, he would end up being taken in by his own trick, by believing it. He would then be the prisoner of his own formulas and would lose all effectiveness as a propagandist. What protects him from this is precisely the organization to which he belongs, which rigidly maintains a line. The propagandist thus becomes more and more the technician who treats his patients in various ways, but keeps himself cold and aloof, selecting his words and actions for purely technical reasons. The patient is an object to be saved or sacrificed according to the necessities of the cause. So this is where their delusions of grandeur, I try to put that in my tone of voice, come from. But then, the reader may ask, why the system of human contacts? Why the importance of door-to-door visits? Only a technical necessity dictates them. We know how important human relations, technical necessity or human nature, this annoying thing called human nature for these propagandists. We know how important human relations can be to the individual and how essential personal contact is in making decisions. We know that the distant word of the radio must be complemented by the warmth of a personal presence. This is exactly what puts the human relations technique of propaganda into play. But this human contact is false and merely simulated. The presence is not that of the individual who has come forward, but that of the organization behind him. In the very act of pretending to speak as man to man, this is what pissed me off about that bitch, by the way. The propagandist is reaching the summit of his mendacity, mentirosa, and falsification, puta, even when he is not conscious of it. And that's the organization of propaganda. A lot of pages. Next part is orthopraxy. Hopefully you can see this because the screen looks bad. But anyway, that's my video for today. The Organization of Propaganda by Jacques Silal, Propaganda.